one-third of the member of a project that we are about to undertake, or rather undertaking with in partnership with two other organizations, WWF South Africa and the Institute for Economic Justice. And if you will just quickly allow me just to touch on the objectives, outcomes, and impact of the CAAP project, and then I will introduce what it is that we want to be doing today. So just quickly, the objective of the CAAP project is to enable civil society organizations to engage as actors of governance and development for tracking climate change in South Africa. The outcome of this particular project will be to improve the collaboration across civil societies and build a well-informed and strong connected network of civil society organizations whom are better capacitated to raise awareness and engage their constituencies, and specifically to articulate climate demands with clear linkages to the issues of rights, gender, and economic justice. And the impact we hope to achieve with the project is the development and implementation of more ambitious climate policy that promotes climate equity and advancing gender equality and economic justice and the realization of human rights. So let me take this moment then to thank the colleagues at the European Union for their support in making it possible, not only for our meeting up today for this webinar, but also for the execution of the CAAP project. They are our funder or co-funder in this particular intervention. Also, let me allow time then just to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Ms. Ariane Labat, I hope I pronounced it correctly, as part of the delegation from the European Union. She will be hosting us today with the opening remarks for today's webinar. Is Ariane available to speak? May I call upon her now? And then also just to say welcome, colleagues. Thank you so much for your time in the busy days. I know this time of the year tends to be very busy, and we appreciate your time to join us for this webinar. Thank you so much. Ariane, are you available?
Thank you so much, Kando. Mwanweni Nonke, thank you so much to have us with you today. So I'm Ariane Labat, the counselor at the EU delegation working on climate policy. This program is made available by my colleague Lydia Afonso Gallegos, who leads with green cooperation programs between South African partners and us from the EU side. And I'm really honored to be with you, and most importantly, to be with IPCC authors. Francois and Montero are really extremely influential scientists of the global climate action. And we also take into account their findings also to develop EU policy. So from the EU perspective, it's just important to tell you all our climate intervention in Europe and our relation with South Africa on advancing climate policy is really science-based. We take into account very seriously the message from IPCC authors about the need to accelerate our ambition across all dimensions, reduction of emission, but also climate adaptation. And we take that science message into account when we develop the priority focus of our different interventions. If you think, for instance, of the climate adaptation agenda, it's very much all the literature about resilience opportunities, which group are most affected by climate risk, and which intervention have the best potential to enhance the resilience and our capacity to adapt to climate change. It's very much driven by the findings by scientific experts that tell us about the connection, for instance, between climate issues, but also food security issues and biodiversity degradation. So in our work with policymakers, with stakeholders, with climate youth as well, the messages from IPCC authors is extremely important. This is the first of many conversations, I'm sure. From the EU side, we are here also to share with you, enable you to have access to the practitioners on European side be they members of trade union, of civil society, climate youth movement, but also mayors, responsibles of provinces and regions, who are in, I would say, at the coal face, of implementing climate policies in their respective jurisdictions, because that's also one of our key roles, to facilitate the collaboration of peer-to-peers on European side and on your side as climate champions, so that collectively we know faster what are the best practice, and we are empowered to implement these solutions in our respective communities. I don't want to take more time, just to tell you again, Lydia and myself, we are here to facilitate your access to knowledge, to experiences, to funding where it's appropriate, and to fight together these climate change fights on the same side. I look forward to our discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ariane, for your opening remarks. Colleagues, we are now going to introduce to you the moderator and the speakers for today's webinar, as we unpack then the IPCC report and what it means for, particularly what it means for civil society in South Africa. And then quickly before I forget, the hashtag for today's conversation is hashtag IPCC report SA. I believe it has been put in the chat. All right, so quickly then to introduce our moderator, who will also then introduce our speakers. Zugiswa Mqolomba is a senior executive with roots deeply embedded in economics, poverty, and public policy work. She is a Mandela Rhodes Scholar and a Chevening, if I pronounced that correctly, scholar. She has 2 master's degrees, a master from the UCT and a master's in poverty and development from the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom, Bristol. She also holds an executive leadership training certificate in the 21st century leadership from Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government in Boston, the USA. She is currently doing her PhD in development studies at WITS. She has won international, continental, and domestic awards for her leadership in public policy. She used to work for the presidency of South Africa at the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation as a senior sector expert, specifically within this senior economist. She is also an external facilitator for Landness, a network of civil society organizations advocating for land and environmental rights for vulnerable communities, land, governance, and administration, as well as climate action and the just transition. She now works as an executive manager for research and training, monitoring and evaluation at the NDDA. And she facilitates conservationists and in public speaking, moderation, dialogue coordination, training, and teaching. And we are happy to introduce you, Zugi. We're happy to have you with us. And please, if you could come on and then also introduce our esteemed panelists for today's webinar. Thank you. Zugi, you're on mute.
So I was saying thank you so much to Tanda and the SACAN team. It's my pleasure today and honor really to be a part of this conversation and to be moderating today's session. I also want to welcome all the guests to our webinar, which is basically a webinar for civil society organized by the South African Climate Action Network and Unpacking the IPCC AR6 Working Group 1 report with civil society. This webinar is part of the Climate Ambition to Accountability project by WWF Africa in partnership with the Institute for Economic Justice and the South African Climate Action Network, and it is co-funded by the European Union. For this webinar, we are joined by 2 of the South African climate scientists and authors who contributed to the IPCC AR6 Working Group 1 report. The aim of this webinar is to unpack what the report means for South African communities and how it will affect and impact the work of South African civil society organizations and community-based organizations. So this session now will start with a few words of remarks from the panelists, followed by a Q&A session that I will facilitate between myself and the facilitators, which we will open to our audience for questions for at least about 15 minutes. We hope you enjoyed today's session and that we learn together as we break down the science behind the IPCC AR6 Working Group 1 report. And as Tando has already said, join the conversation by sharing your comments and questions on social media, and the hashtag that you can use is IPCC Report SA. This webinar is also being streamlined on the South African Climate Action Network Facebook page. But before we allow for a few words of remarks from our panelists, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists, Professor Francois Engelbrecht, I hope I haven't murdered your name, and Dr. Pedro Monteiro. So Professor Francois is a professor of climatology at the Global Change Institute of the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, which is WITS. He specializes in numerical climate model development and the simulation of African climate variability and change. In particular, he currently leads the development of an African-based Earth system model towards participation in the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project Phase 6 of the World Climate Research Program. His research has led to new insights into the changing temperature, rainfall, and circulation patterns over the continent under enhanced anthropogenic forcing. He served as an invited lead author of the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming, which was published in 2018, and he is the lead author of Working Group 1 of Assessment Report 6 of the IPCC Chapter 4. He is also an invited member of the Working Group on Numerical Experimentation of the World Climate Change Research Program and a steering group member of the Climate and Ocean Variability, Predictability, and Change Project of the WCRP. Thank you for joining us, Professor Francois. It is a pleasure and honor to have you with us. And then Dr. Pedro, he is a chief oceanographer at CSIR with a special interest in the understanding of how and why the ocean biogeochemistry of oxygen and carbon adjusts to climate variability. The use of numerical modeling as experimental platforms to understand scale sensitivities of coupled physics and biogeochemical processes in the Southern Ocean is also a key focus. This is being used to contribute to reducing uncertainty in long-term evolution of the climate carbon system in fully coupled Earth system models. Dr. Pedro is the lead author for Chapter 5. Welcome both to our panelists. It is an honor really to have you amongst us. And I'll now give you a few minutes to make some opening remarks before we go into the Q&A questions with our audience. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Suki, for the introduction. Greatly appreciated. Also good to see Ariane again, and thanks also to Tabu for the introduction. Everybody, I'm going to share my screen and just show you a few pictures while I make these remarks, as Suki has just indicated I'll do. We don't have so much time, so of course I will have to give a very, very concise overview of the climate aspects of the assessment report, and my colleague Pedro Monteiro will of course speak in more detail about some of the important implications for carbon. But let's jump in immediately. I think what you all must have noticed in the media in recent weeks is of course a great sense of urgency around the climate crisis. And to some extent, that is the result of the upcoming 26th Conference of the Parties, the United Nations Climate Change Negotiations meeting that will happen in early November this year. That is really something to follow. But of course, that urgency towards COP26 is to a very large extent originating from this most recent report from the IPCC. It has been called by the United Nations Secretary General a code red for humanity, partially because of the fact that the evidence is now mounting that the window that we still have left open to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, that window is rapidly closing. Let me explain why I'm saying that and why to some extent the report is saying that. Global warming is of course strengthening, and the report has assessed that we have now reached a level of global warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius. Why is this so important? It's so important because it is thought that the dangerous thresholds of climate change, where aspects of climate change become irreversible, those thresholds may well be somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And then the report also made an assessment that we are now unfortunately steaming towards exceeding those thresholds. If we continue to live our lives on the planets like we are currently living our lives. Now, on this specific slide, you can see on the left-hand side the different degrees of global warming, and on the right-hand side, different climate change mitigation scenarios are being listed. So the top dark red line on this graph shows a future that is a low mitigation future, where we continue to grow the world's economy using fossil fuels. And you can see that the report has made an assessment that for such a future, global warming may in fact be very close to reaching a level of 5 degrees Celsius towards the end of this century. On the other hand, if we follow a very, very strong or a high mitigation future, listed there at the bottom, the so-called shared socioeconomic pathway 1.9, then you can see the report has assessed that we may well restrict global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the specific confidence language that the report uses is that it is now, as we are meeting here today, more likely than not that we will exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold of global warming. That is even if we do everything that we should do to mitigate, and we have the strongest possible climate action we can imagine. Unfortunately, the indications are now there that we've left action too late and we will exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. More likely than not, it may happen as early as the early 2030s. But then there are also positive aspects of the report. My colleague Pedro Monteiro will talk about this in more detail, I think. But in the presence of certain types of mitigation actions, there's a good chance that in the second half of the century, we may get the global temperature back to below 1.5 degrees Celsius again. So that's quite interesting. I think we'll talk more about that. And if we take the strongest possible mitigation actions, the chances are excellent that we can restrict global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. So much of global warming and climate change is still in our hands as humans. We can still slow it down. We can still restrict this. Why are these thresholds of 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming so important? For various reasons, but it starts with sea level rise. The report has assessed that somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, it's possible that we will initiate the irreversible melting of the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. Now that will commit future generations to about 12 meters of sea level rise. So that's staggering to think that we are changing. We are a generation that can still prevent this from happening. But we may also be known in the future as the generation that really changed the face of the planet. We may literally make the planet smaller with less living space for future generations. But what about our own lifetimes? Aspects of climate change will become dangerous in our own lifetime. And in fact, in the next 2 decades, if we fail to mitigate climate change. I'll have to be very swift in showing you these last few slides. But they show projected changes of temperature patterns across the world as a function of certain degrees of global warming. Top left, for example, how will temperature patterns look like for a world that has warmed to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the world we may well live in the early 2030s? You can see that Southern Africa warms relatively fast, and that's important. As we look at higher and higher levels of global warming, as you can see in those graphics, you can see that regional temperature change in Southern Africa reaches values in the order of 6 degrees Celsius. And that will, of course, have devastating impact, starting with our agriculture, but more widely, also in terms of biodiversity, our own health as humans, if we think about the effects of oppressive temperatures on humans. But because we must be very quick today, let me jump to the projections of future rainfall patterns, also as a function of the level of global warming. And you can see the other important part of the message for our region. Our region is also likely to become drier. So not only does it become drastically warmer, it's also one of the few land areas in the world that are projected to become drier as the world warms up. You can see in the Northern Hemisphere, it's quite different. Most of the northern land masses are likely to become wetter in a changing climate. That's why we are a climate change hotspot. We all know Southern Africa is a region that is naturally warm and dry. Now it's becoming drastically warmer. At the same time, it's becoming drier. There's very little we can do to adapt under such a change. We say adaptation options are limited. And that is what makes our region one of the most vulnerable in the world. And that's why the IPCC classified us as a climate change hotspot back in 2018. So I'd like to conclude with this slide. We should, of course, think about the systematic changes in the regional climate system and what the impacts will be in Southern Africa and across the African continent. But we also need to think about high impact climate change events that may happen over the next few decades, even within the next 10 years, or as the IPCC calls it, the near term, the next 20 years. We need to consider the possibility of unprecedented climate change events happening in our region, events we've never experienced before. So climate change science tells us that the region is not only likely to become drier on the average, it will also experience more frequent droughts. So we need to think very, very clearly, firstly, as South Africans, about the possibility of a day zero type drought impacting on the Gauteng province. It's not only our southern provinces that are vulnerable, it's also the summer rainfall region. So what about the possibility of a multi-year drought affecting our mega dams and eventually severely compromising the Gauteng water supply? It will be an event of immense impact, and climate science tells us this is something that may happen even in the next 10 years or the next 20 years. What about impacts on climate change on our agriculture? We all know how vulnerable we are during periods of drought, but the next 20 years will bring more drought to Southern Africa than the last 20 years. And if we fail to mitigate climate change and we reach values of global warming of 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius, maybe somewhere in the second half of the century, then the science tells us that we are in fact looking at a collapse of our staple food, the maize crop, and a collapse in the cattle industry. The next 20 years will bring bigger heat waves than ever seen before in the region. We are extremely vulnerable, all our people living in informal housing. If you don't have access to air conditioning and easy access to cool water, heat waves are life-threatening. The heat waves of the next 10 years will be like nothing we've ever seen before in the region. It's even true for the next 10 years. We don't even have to go further into the future. And then finally, what about an intense tropical cyclone reaching northeastern South Africa? We know how absolutely devastating these systems are in Mozambique. But in a warmer world, it's possible that an intense cyclone can, for the very first time, reach Maputo, Richards Bay, or it can move down in the Limpopo River Basin between South Africa and Zimbabwe. And of course, I don't think we are prepared for such an event at all. So with these messages of risk, of course, we need to think about what we can do about all of this in terms of climate change, adaptation, and other forms of climate action we can take. I hope we'll have time to discuss these aspects, but for now, Zuki, I think it's better that I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Montero. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Francis. I think you've really brought the reality of the seriousness of climate change, in particular when it comes to its impact on our region as Sub-Sahara and South Africa in particular. So it's no longer just a dream, a nightmare really, but we've actually brought into reality the seriousness of why climate change action needs to take place as a matter of urgency. Thank you so much for those great insights. So we hand over to you, Dr. Pedros, for your keynote insights for our audience, please, before we move into the Q&A session of this webinar. Over to you, Dr. Pedro. Dr. Pedro, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, I'm just setting up, just checking whether you can see the, what's happening here. Why is this not going to, can you see my first slide? It doesn't look like it.
Yes, Dr. Pedro, we can see both you and your slides, but I'm not sure if you have the ability to move up and down. That might be a function that's not enabled that we can we can try to quickly fix for you if that's a requirement.
It seems to be, can you see the slides move like that?
Yes, no, we can see the slides move now.
Okay. All right, perfect. All right, well, so thanks very much, and it's very nice to be here with you. This is an extremely short presentation, so you certainly there's going to be no unpacking from our part about the details of the science, but just a few very high-level messages. So first of all, let me just start off by acknowledging my colleagues in the carbon chapter of the IPCC. I think that the success of every chapter depends on the lead author team, and we had an excellent one. Actually, this morning, that's worth mentioning, the Nobel Prize for Physics has been awarded to 3 scientists who have been involved in different ways in developing the climate models that have brought us to here today.
Oh wow!
And so it's a very special moment, actually. Okay, so I think the key thing is that a key difference, first of all, between the Sixth Assessment Report, the Working Group 1 report, and the 1.5 degree special report that was issued in 2018, is really that is a much more precise assessment of the link between mitigation, the science behind the need for mitigation, and the climate response. In other words, what is really identifying that there's in fact a pathway, which Francois alluded to, that in fact we can make it, and we have a much better precision around how to get there. But as Francois mentioned, it depends on a number of uncertainties which are not well constrained at this stage. Okay, so I really wanted to mention just 2 main points. First of all, I'd like to pick up again on a point that Francois mentioned, which are the tipping points, because they are really important around the question which a lot of people ask is, why 1.5 degrees centigrade? Okay, why not 2 or 3? And the second point is really about the idea of carbon being our main lever towards achieving that 1.5 degrees centigrade. So what I've got here is actually a little bit of science which already has emerged after the end of the IPCC. Okay, so it's very, very new. And what it highlights on the left-hand side are what are the global tipping points, potential global tipping points. And on the right-hand side, with temperature on the y-axis and all these potential tipping points along the x-axis, what it does show is that in going from already at 1.5 degrees centigrade, we're getting very close to the probability of activating some of these tipping points. Now, although this was not assessed in this level of detail in Working Group 1, what Working Group 1 did assess is that none of the emission scenarios that were assessed, whether it was high or low mitigation, can exclude any one of these tipping points. Okay, so that was a key finding. But the most important issue here is that the difference between in going from 1.5 degrees here and 2 degrees there, you can see the number of how it influences the probability of a whole range of instabilities in the global climate system and the potential impacts that it has. And it's not just the individual systems that could become tipping points, they can be cascades. So for example, it's mechanistically possible that the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet could shut down the Atlantic meridional circulation, overturning circulation, which would start to increase the retention of heat in the Southern Ocean, which would warm it up effectively, accelerating the collapse of the Antarctic ice sheets. So you can see how it's not impossible that these can actually lead to these kind of connected cascades of outcomes. Now, the reason for highlighting this is that in concentrating around what's important to South Africa, through government and through business, have to also be focusing on the importance of having a global voice. Because actually the answer to this level of outcome lies in the global concerted action, of which South Africa is a really important contributor. Okay, so now moving on to carbon. So this is really just a very, very high level. So carbon has kind of these three main high level components. Of course, we assess the science that makes it possible to highlight these three main points. So we hear a lot about net zero emissions. So net zero emissions have become an incredibly powerful policy device. However, they are strongly based on the science that we have been doing around carbon and climate, and particularly the role of the ocean in helping us understand how it's possible to make net zero important. So effectively what net zero means that as we've got here, every ton of CO2 emitted adds to global warming. So if we stop emitting CO2, we will stop additional warming, okay? We already have some stored warming, but we'll come to that in a minute. So the first step is really stopping additional warming. That's why net zero is so important. However, just determining the temperature that you want to get to is not enough. The temperature at which you get to net zero is determined by what's called the remaining carbon budget. And the remaining carbon budget set is the amount of carbon that you can still burn and stay within a certain temperature, but not just the temperature, but also it assesses the probability of staying below that temperature. So it's critical that when we talk about net zero by 2050, we have to say, what is the temperature target, 1.5 or 2? What is the probability of getting there? And then from that, we get the amount of CO2. On top of that, there's also the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And they become they're also a factor which has been assessed in determining the remaining carbon budget. So this is actually a very precise treatment that we have now to allow policy positions to be made with greater confidence. Finally, there's negative emissions. And negative emissions are where we actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere, are absolutely essential in order to address the historical emissions of CO2. In other words, the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere and continues to warm up the atmosphere unless we start to bring that CO2 down. Okay, so these are the kind of the key elements that link the science to the mitigation response. Now, I want to be clear that this is working group 1 that we're talking about. So it's the science. The actual what to do about it, how to achieve this, is really the remit of working group 3, which is going to be released in about April next year. I'm not going to touch on this because this is a very important figure that explains a little bit of what I've been talking about, but I'm sure it'll come up in the discussion and I'll come back to it. But essentially, I'm borrowing a metaphor from COVID to say that instead of going business as usual, which we are at the moment, which will take us up this way, we actually need to follow this route, as Francois mentioned earlier. Finally, in terms of, for South Africa, in terms of the net zero emissions challenges and negative emissions challenges, I would also like to highlight that, in fact, there are challenges and there are opportunities. On the challenge side is that if we are not sufficient in terms of the way we support the global challenge, then we go into what I call the paradox for the just transition, which is that without achieving those deep, strategic deep mitigation targets, the cost of adaptation becomes too high. So it's actually really important that on the basis of the science from Working Group 1, that South African policy shifts its position more away from the 2-degree target, which it is still at the moment, even with the new NDCs, towards a more explicitly in the 1.5 degree centigrade. We probably have one opportunity globally and regionally to get this right. And actually so this is actually where the support of civil society is also really important. In terms of negative emissions, there are some really important opportunities that will emerge in this important area. And that's really that we're sitting, as this article on the right-hand side highlights, we are having to do something for which we don't have the methods in place. And this is real. We should see this as an opportunity of our science and innovation system in partnership with our colleagues around the world, in Europe, US, China, to actually play a major role in contributing to developing the capabilities to make the 1.5 degree target at the end of the century possible. So I think I'll leave it there. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedro. That was particularly insightful, particularly in terms of understanding what the challenges and opportunities for climate change action will be for South Africa and the region at large. Thank you so much. A very insightful presentation as well from you. And now we will hand over to our Q&A with the audience, and just to get the ball rolling, and just to make sure that, because obviously this report is highly scientific in terms of its language. And sometimes ordinary people might not have an understanding of even the definition of climate change and how it impacts on our societies at large. So just to quickly ask the first question to get the ball rolling, just to bring it home, why should this report matter for the ordinary man on the street? Well, obviously, this report is undoubtedly one of the most important and influential reports that will come out this year in relation to climate change. So why should communities and ordinary people care about climate change or climate change action or inaction? and how are they directly affected by climate change? Just to bring it home to the man on the street, why should this report matter to me as an ordinary citizen living in Khayelitsha, living in KwaNobuhle, living in Alexandra, living in Diepsloot? Why should this report actually matter? I'm posing both questions, both to you, Prof, as well as Doc, to you, Doc. Just a few seconds of your time in terms of this particular question. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Zuki. So there are two aspects. I think Pedro will speak very well to one and I can speak to the other. Our lives will be directly affected by climate change in two ways. Firstly, climate change may very well change the South African economy and how we generate energy in South Africa, but I'll leave it to Pedro to talk to that. Climate change will also impact on our daily lives through more frequent extreme weather events, impacting on the South African economy and impacting on our day-to-day lives. For example, let me just mention three aspects. We need to be extremely careful, firstly, in terms of how specifically heat waves will increasingly impact on the health of South Africans. And heat waves can even cause human mortality, as we have seen just about 2 months ago in a part of the world where we didn't expect this at all, namely the southwestern part of Canada and British Columbia. So when heat waves impact on regions where people do not have air conditioning, for example, in South Africa's very large informal settlements, we need to realize that these oppressive temperatures become literally life-threatening, especially to elderly people. So that is one direct impact we will increasingly have to live with and learn to cope with in South Africa already right now and increasingly so over the next 10 years. Then our farmers. We all know, of course, that the South African government has very extensive plans about land reform in South Africa. So what about our new farmers taking on the challenge of farming in a semi-arid region such as Southern Africa? Climate science tells us that farming over the next 20 years is going to be more challenging than farming was over the last 20 years. It's already challenging. But rain-fed agriculture in Southern Africa is going to be increasingly challenging even for commercial farmers. Now, I am not even speaking of the millions of subsistence farmers that still live in Southern Africa. We've seen over the last 10 years how people have been displaced from Zimbabwe, right now in Madagascar, by long-lasting droughts. So climate change will already over the next 20 years bring more frequent long-lasting droughts to our region. That will directly impact on our farmers. It may bring a range of problems, for example, farmers forced to give up their way of life and move to the cities. And then thirdly, I can just briefly mention, of course, the impacts of big flood events. Just think about 2019, the Durban floods, the Pietermaritzburg floods and mudslides. It killed 80 people in South Africa. And in Mozambique, just a month before that, the tropical cyclone killed more than 1,300 people. So our lives are directly impacted by extreme rainfall events and flooding, and that impact will also be more severe over the next 20 years compared to the last 20.
No, thank you, Prof. And just Dr. Pedro, just maybe a few minutes, because we've got questions already from the audience. Why should this report matter to the man on the street?
Thanks. So I mean, Francois has already mentioned the importance of extremes, and that's really an important issue. So how we manage them is going to be critical. And what this report has shown is that the probability of these extremes increases measurably for every 0.5 degree warming. So it is quantified at that level. So events that are one in 100-year events at 1 degree centigrade become 1 every 5 year to annual events at 2 to 3 degrees centigrade. So those are the kind of issues that should worry all of us, particularly in terms of what Francois was saying, food and health. Now, the second is on in responding to that, which means that in order to stay under the 1.5 degrees centigrade, there's a fundamental reorganization of the South African energy system and economy. And this is an opportunity, actually, to bring all South Africans into the mainstream economy. And the Presidential Climate Change Commission is starting to play a critical role in setting out the path that could be followed in order to achieve that. In other words, really turn this into a threat, from a threat into an opportunity to really address the inequality in our society. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is really around the technological and innovation aspect. So those are two ways in which, so that's the sort of education, the innovation side. So those are the two ways in which we will see everyone, whether in South Africa, affected in one way or other by what the next 10 years and beyond.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Pedro. So there's a question from our audience, one of our participants, Ukugu Nonjinge, and she's asking to Dr. Pedro if you could please make special mention of the role of civil society, especially in terms of building climate resilience. What is, especially when it comes to building climate resistance and ensuring that there is a committed and coordinated effort backed by significant resources and a population that understands and supports the need for prioritizing climate change. Currently, she says, we have a large population of citizens that are not even literate. So how do we address this? What is the role of civil society in ensuring effective climate action on the part of government? And what is the role of even coalition building and solidarity movements when it comes to our climate action response as a country and continent at large? And this question is directed towards Dr. Pedro. Over to you, Doc.
I'm a mere scientist. You all have the hard work, the hard part of the job, which is, and I mean, you know much better than I do about how to answer that question. But where I think something I think that would be very useful is to have some mechanism that enables a more regular engagement between climate scientists and civil society organizations. I think that would be a really productive way of taking that forward. But I mean, we climate scientists and we can engage with you about what the science provides, the insight that the science provides that enables you to make decisions about plans and facilitate the transitions that are required.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Pedro. Then, Tando Lukuko, I've noted your hand, but I'm first going to go to Andrea Weiss. Her question is, do you anticipate that parts of South Africa will become completely uninhabitable at the current warming trajectory? And I'll hand that question over to Prof. Francois, if you could please answer that question for us.
Thanks, Andrea, for that question. And it, of course, depends to a very large extent about what humanity is going to decide in terms of the future greenhouse gas trajectory of the planet. So for these low mitigation futures, I've shown there right at the beginning of my talk, where global warming reaches values in the order of 4 degrees Celsius towards the end of the century. We should realize that of course translates to increases in the South African interior easily in the order of 6 degrees Celsius, even more. And that will be also accompanied by general reductions in rainfall and more frequent drought. So such a future that may well await us under a low mitigation pathway for the world in the second half of the century, we should realize that's a future where you cannot grow maize in Southern Africa. It's a future where you cannot keep cattle in Botswana or in Limpopo province or Northwest or the Northern Cape, purely because of the immense heat stress and the impact on all mammals. So that will be certainly a Southern Africa less habitable than the one we know today. You won't be able to do certain types of farming. Just try to imagine Botswana without cattle. 70% of the people still depend on cattle today in Botswana to some extent. So it will be a completely different world. It will be a less livable world. It doesn't mean that people will fall down and die when they walk around in this future Southern Africa, but it will be far more difficult to generate livelihoods as we generate these today. So yes, Andrea, we are heading under such futures to a substantially less habitable regional world effectively. I think also important is to realize that in such a world, the sustainable growth of our cities will also be heavily compromised because of heat impacts on people, but perhaps even more importantly, because of more frequent water shortages introduced by these general reductions in rainfall and more frequent droughts.
Thank you, Prof. I think this is a sufficient answer, actually. Very insightful indeed. Then we'll just take two more questions. I want to address Mr. Prabhat. His question is, in your view, Dr. Pedro, has the South African response to the report been satisfactory? And just in general, is South Africa's climate change response satisfactory and sufficient? Or are there gaps that you think that need to be addressed in South Africa's climate change action? And then I will go to Thando for his question. So Thando will be the last person to ask a question, and we will then hand over to Thando for our vote of thanks. Over to you, Dr. Pedro.
Yeah, look, I'm now wearing my hat as a South African citizen, as a South African more than as just a scientist. And I think that we are starting to see a greater willingness to be more to begin to shift towards the right level of action that in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Are we where we need to be? No. And so effectively we're starting to move, and I believe that with a collaboration across all sectors, which includes yourselves, government through the presidential and the coordination of the Presidential Climate Commission, government, business, and our international collaborators, and most importantly, who will be key partners in supporting the government finance towards to enable this decarbonizing the South African economy. I think that we'll get there, but it is important that we as South Africans keep reminding our government and business that the targets that have been set by Working Group 1 of AR6 are actually important and necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Pedro. Over to you, Thando Lukuko. So the time now is 2 o'clock. After your comment or question, we will just ask our panelists to make their closing remarks, literally 1 minute each, before we go to a vote of thanks and closing by our coordinator, Thando Lukuko. Over to you, Thando.
Thanks, Zudi. I'm actually wondering if our panelists wouldn't like to say their closing remarks, because my closing comments are related to that question that was asked by Google, and I think it's also a good response to close on, if that's okay.
Awesome.
With.
So Professor Francois, over to you, a 1 minute closing remark, and then we will have Dr. Pedro, and then we will hand over to Thando Lukuko to make the vote of thanks and to close on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you again, Zuki, for the invitation to present to this audience today. I would say, let us look it straight in the eye that the world is committed to some further warming, even in the presence of strong climate action. The best that we can do in that context as South Africans and as Africans is to have a good understanding of the risks we will face right now and increasingly so over the next 2 decades. And let's prepare to the largest extent that we can for the future impacts of climate change in our region, whether these come via long-lasting droughts, heat waves, or severe storms. Climate science gives us a way to have an idea of what these risks are. So let's adapt to the largest extent that we can to what is coming.
Thank you, Professor. Over to you, Dr. Pedro.
Thanks, Zuki. So I think that we all realize that global warming is global, and climate change, particularly climate extremes, are regional and local. So we feel climate change locally, but the lever of action is a global one. So it's extremely important that, that the link between the region and the global is made both through the science, which it is now in activities like the IPCC, as well as in civil society. That, you know, that civil society, local civil society and global civil society are actually interacting with each other in bringing the impacts and the levers together, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you so much for those closing remarks. There's a lot to think of and a lot to reflect on just on the basis of your presentation today. And thank you for just building that knowledge that civil society needs in order to strengthen its climate change response and to hold government accountable on its climate change response, both now and moving into the future. So over to you, Tano, for the vote of thanks and the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Zuki. So quickly before I close, Gugu, just to say that the question is wonderful. And this is indeed the very challenge that the CAAP project seeks to respond to. There are multiple actors who are working towards addressing the challenge of climate change and also coordinating the various responses. And this is what, through the funding that we've received from the EU project, that we're hoping to achieve. So we'd like to invite Pedro and Francois to join us at the next meeting, of course, if they're available to, and then we could unpack some of these things. I don't know how other colleagues felt. This hour went by very, very quickly. It kind of left me wanting some more. So definitely, I think it would be great to have you guys again. Let me also just take this moment then just to say thank you to everyone who's joined us. Thank you, Dr. Pedro. Thank you, Prof. Francois. I'm not sure if our colleague from the UN is here. I don't think she's here, but I do see Lydia. Lydia, thank you so much as well for joining, and all the other colleagues as well for their time and for staying with us slightly beyond 2 o'clock. If the EU was not present, this particular call would not have been possible. So also a special thanks to them for the support that they provided to us for making it possible. Colleagues, thank you so much for your time, and let me not take up any further. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day and your week. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Did I say the UN?
Pato and Tando, please stay behind.
Sure.
Tando and Pato and Prapat, please stay behind.
Yes, yes, yes.
All right. Hi, everyone.
Did I say EU or UN?
UN.
You said UN once, and then you said EU.
Damn it.
Oh, let's stop recording.